The media drew all kinds of lessons from this week's political contest, but one conclusion is inescapable. In the ephemeral age of blogging and twittering, one well-reported newspaper story can still blow a hole in a campaign. But there's also the question in this case of the New York Times accepting help from a rival candidate in the form of Oppo research. Connecticut Attorney General Richard Blumenthal had been going around the state talking about his military service, as we see here.
We have learned something very important since the days that I served in Vietnam, and you exemplify it.
But as the Times reported, Blumenthal never did serve in Vietnam. He was in the Marine Corps Reserves. The Democratic Senate candidate acknowledged that, but went on the offensive.
On a few occasions, I have misspoken about my service, and I regret that, and I take full responsibility. But I will not allow anyone to take a few misplaced words and impugn my record of service to our country.
Amen. Meanwhile, Fox News broke the story of Congressman Mark Souder, who preached the importance of abstinence while having an affair with an aide on his House payroll. And even as the Indiana Republican said he would resign, didn't take long for media organizations to find a videotape featuring the mistress, Linda Jackson, interviewing him about the importance of teenagers refraining from sex.
First off, from the topic, how has abstinence education failed? Rather than...
So you knew you were going to be fighting from the get-go.
How hard is it to get kids to abstain from sex, regardless what program you give them?
So what impact is the press having on these midterm elections, and are journalists exaggerating the impact just a bit on a handful of races this week? Joining us now, Dana Milbank, who writes the Washington sketch column for the Washington Post. Margaret Carlson, chief political columnist for Bloomberg News and Washington editor of The Week magazine. And Chris Stirewalt, political editor at the Washington Examiner. Dana Milbank, if you're a New York Times reporter writing about Richard Blumenthal, and you get some help from his Republican opponent in a negative piece, do you have some obligation to tell readers about that?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, you get the information and then you go and verify it yourself. I mean, as reporters, often we're always our best sources on Republicans or often Democrats and vice versa. I think if the Times made any mistake in there, it's that they didn't give full context to saying, well, there were at times when he characterized his service properly. So that was...
The article did say that.
Well, he didn't include the entire full context of the video in one instance. I think they probably regret that mistake. But overall, no, of course, there's nothing wrong with where you get your information from, as long as it's accurate information and you verify.
On the other hand, Linda McMahon, who is now the Republican nominee in Connecticut against Blumenthal, and she's a former World Wrestling Entertainment co-founder, so we'll show you that video in a moment. She didn't do anything to hide her role once this story came out. Let's watch.
And you had no role whatsoever in the New York Times breaking the story.
They had initiated this story. We contributed some research, to the story for the New York Times, but they did the research, they did all the verification for it.
So Margaret Carlson, Linda McMahon, not exactly an off-the-record source here, so why is the New York Times protecting her?
Well, that's just what you'd expect from a candidate of the Hulk Hogan school. Listen, she couldn't resist taking the credit, which in most of these circumstances where Dana Milbank says you get your information at least to start from the opposite side, from an opponent, she wanted to take all that credit. It's a rookie mistake, and she did it. And what the Times didn't do, I think, is these were needles in a haystack. There are hundreds and hundreds of speeches that Richard Blumenthal's given. No newspaper I know, maybe you can dispute this with the Washington Post, has staff to go through hours and hours and hours. She did that, and what I think the Times didn't know was that in that same speech on the video, he speaks totally candidly about his time in the service.
Totally candidly, but let me just mention that a Times spokesman told me that didn't dispute the fact that Linda McMahon had some role, but said the paper had multiple sources, and obviously did a lot of its own research. But Chris Stirewalt, we're talking about a video of one speech that the Times posted on its website. Didn't play the beginning where Blumenthal says he served during Vietnam, did play a later reference where he said he served in Vietnam, but saying you served during Vietnam doesn't contradict the notion that you're saying you were there in a combat zone.
Well, unfortunately for Attorney General Blumenthal, there have subsequently come out other videos in which he goes beyond being oblique about the time of his service and goes straight into sounding like he was victimized by anti-war protesters and other things when he comes home. So sort of the best case for Blumenthal in his spin was that he was intentionally oblique. The worst case is that he was misleading. Neither of them is good. And when you look at what's happened to him in the estimation of voters in Connecticut, it's obvious that this is sort of a character issue that they're not satisfied with.
And other newspaper articles have come out, for example, the Stanford Advocate quoting Blumenthal as having said, "I wore the uniform in Vietnam." Now, Blumenthal says, well, he's not responsible for what every paper writes, but he has a press staff that could easily have corrected this. Let me move on to Mark Sauter. You wrote about him, the former congressman, this week, Dana Milbank. Let's play a little bit of the former congressman's, reaction to the story when he had to acknowledge that he had an affair with an aide. This, of course, coming from the champion of abstinence.
I sinned against God, my wife, and my family by having a mutual relationship with a part-time member of my staff. In the poisonous environment of Washington, D.C., any personal failing is seized upon